Yeah, I am Richard DeGeorge. I am an emeritus professor from University of Kansas, where I had various positions. I was distinguished professor of philosophy, of Soviet and East European studies, and an adjunct professor in the business school, and I was co-director of the International Center for Ethics in Business.
And you also had an honorary doctorate.
I have an honorary doctorate from the University of Nyenrode, and what impresses people more than the fact that I have an honorary doctorate is that on the stage with me when I got it were two other people who got honorary doctorates, Bill Gates and Nelson Mandela. So how did I get into that trio? Well, that's a story I can tell you if you're interested, but that was the trio.
So what brought you to the field of business ethics? Why?
Okay, there was no field, so I wasn't brought to the field. In a lot of ways, I was part of a group that made the field. But let me tell you a little bit about my interests. I've been interested in ethics, not meta-ethics, but ethics as it applies to society. And one of the first books I did was in 1966, when I invited a group of philosophers and other people actually to talk about ethics and society. What does ethics have to contribute to society? And some of these were people who did mostly meta-ethics, people like Charles Stevenson, Henry Aiken. Brand Blanchard was an idealist, but he didn't do applied ethics at all. So I had a whole gamut of people whom I asked to turn their attention to how does ethics apply in society? What difference does it make? And that was picked up as an Anchor Doubleday book and sold very well, so that 50,000 copies were sold, and the royalties went to my university. I'll just add that because they had paid for the series. But that shows you that I was interested in the practical aspects of how do you apply ethics to society early on. I was asked to join the Soviet and East European Studies program and to teach Marxism. And I had never had a course in Marxism or in Soviet philosophy. And I said, this is a drawback. And they said, well, get a grant, learn. So I spent a year and a half learning, went to the center in Switzerland, in Fribourg, spent a year there at the Center for East European Studies, the only one that concentrates on philosophy, was funded by a Ford Foundation grant, convinced the people at Ford that I should go to the Soviet Union. This was 1963, the height of the Cold War, and I did tour Soviet Union for a month, visiting with the philosophers whom I had been reading and finding out what they thought. That resulted in 3 books. One was Patterns of Soviet Thought, in which I lay out how Marxism developed, especially in the Soviet Union. The second one was the Soviet Ethics and Morality. So I made a study of what ethics means from a Soviet Marxist point of view. And I was, as you can imagine, critical of a good deal of it. And that provoked a response from Soviet philosophers. So we had something of a dialogue going on. It was more of attack and counterattack than dialogue, but at least something was happening. And the third book was The New Marxism, which dealt with humanistic developments in Marxist theory in Eastern Europe. In about 1974, I had a luncheon with the dean of the business school at KU, and we were talking about the sad state of ethics in business. And he, of course, approached it from the point of view of business. I approached it from the point of view of, rather, how do we defend capitalism? How do we defend human business institutions when they're being attacked from the other side? We have a Cold War going on, and actually the Soviets were claiming the moral high ground. And we seem not to be terribly interested in defending the moral high ground. And I thought, this is a big mistake. We should be defending our system as morally justifiable and admit it does some things poorly and it has to be improved. But the way to improve it is from within, not by revolution. And then the two of us said, why don't we have a conference in which we invite people to talk about this? So we held what Norman Bowie considers the first conference on business ethics. And it had the major topic, is private enterprise compatible with social justice? And we had Michael Harrington on the one hand, who was the head of the American Communist Party, insofar as there was one. He was a democratic socialist, actually. And Irving Kristol, who was a commentator, defender of capitalism, as the two keynote speakers. And then we invited a host of other people, business people, people in government, people in academia, to talk about different aspects of really ethics in business. And I edited the papers, and in 1978, Ethics, Free Enterprise, and Public Policy appeared, and both the conference and the book got the attention of NEH, and NEH called up the dean and said, how would you like $300,000 to work on the relation of business and the humanities? So we considered it for 2 seconds and said yes. And under that program, I developed a course in business ethics, which I thought was the appropriate answer to the Marxist challenge. And as part of the grant, I wrote up a 90-page booklet on how to teach business ethics, and I used the book that we had published as the basis and developed the course, and then sent out a notice saying, I have a 90-page booklet on how to teach business ethics. Who wants it? And I was surprised to get 900 people who wanted it, which told me, well, this must be an area in which there is interest and maybe a need. So I set to work writing what I thought was a basic text on business ethics, which was then published in 1982 and went through 7 editions. And I envisaged that book as being an attempt to show people how one could systematically approach business ethics, because prior to that there had been social issues in management, there had been various movements, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, the anti-military industrial complex movement, the anti-globalization movement, but they didn't hang together. And my attempt was to say, look, philosophy can provide a framework to bring all of these together in some manageable, systematic, coherent way. And I'm going to show you one way to do it. That's the way I approached my book, and that's how I got into the field. I didn't intend, and I never expected and didn't want to develop a theory the way business schools typically expect their people to come up with a new theory. I thought we had enough tools in ethics that if properly used, we could show how something like a field should develop. And what I was interested in was trying to show people that there was a field, and the field is business ethics, and here's how you can approach it systematically. So what I did was, actually, if I go behind the scenes, what I had in mind was, if you pardon the term, a Hegelian view to show how business ethics was all interconnected. And I thought, well, you have to start somewhere. And where I started was with what I call the myth of amoral business. And the argument there was that people in the United States, and I concentrated on the United States, are ambiguous about business. On the one hand, they'll complain about how they're being ripped off all the time and business has no ethics. And on the other hand, they'll criticize business from an ethical point of view. Now, the two don't seem to hang together very well. But Claude Lévi-Strauss was an anthropologist who said, myth is the way people interpret their culture. So we know about the Greek myth, but there are contemporary myths. And I said, yeah, that's right. And the notion that business that is amoral is a myth, because on the one hand, people seem to act as if, and businesses seem to act as if that's true. And on the other hand, we have all these complaints. The only way to capture both parts is to see it as part of a myth and unpack that myth, show what is hidden that has to be revealed. That was the introduction. And then I turned to systematically to the defense of capitalism. So Americans just accepted free enterprise capitalism, very rarely asked, is this justifiable? But people in a lot of countries around the world, especially those who followed the Soviet line, said that capitalism is inherently immoral. So I took it as a challenge to say, okay, if you think about slaveholding and you ask, is somebody a good slaveholder? Does he beat his slaves less than other people? You can say, yeah, this is a good slaveholder. But it's rather odd to say that slaveholders are good in any way. And I said, is that what we're doing in the United States? Do we have a sort of slavery, as Marx claims, and we're trying to be good within that framework? Or can we really defend the framework and show that it is not something that's inherently immoral, but something that has defects and can be fixed from within? That was the introduction to the systematic defense of capitalism. And the conclusion of that analysis, and I also looked at socialism, was that from different points of view, each could be defended from a moral point of view. But from the pragmatic point of view, which handles human problems best? Where are people flourishing? Where do we find them more satisfied? It was all on our side, so that people didn't take the Soviet Union as a country to be emulated, where they did take the United States. So I set the framework by saying, look, the framework is fine. Now let's see what's wrong with the details. Then I went into, I said systematically in a Hegelian fashion, and looked at the business world. And the business world was dominated by big business, so I started there rather than with small businesses, although small businesses actually employed more people than big business, but I concentrated on them. And then there were certain fundamental questions that had to be answered. can we really talk about business being moral or immoral, corporation being moral or immoral? Or is that a mistake? Are only people moral or immoral? So people run corporations, people are in corporations, but yet we'll say Ford Motor Company is responsible and is guilty, morally guilty, for making the Pinto, which led to deaths of some people. We use moral terms with respect to corporations, but before we go too far, we should ask ourselves, do we mean the same things by the terms? Do we know what we really mean when we say, oh, the corporation is a bad corporation or a good corporation? What does that mean? So there are a lot of really philosophical questions that had to be answered, and I tried to unpack the language of ethics. Now, I didn't have a theory, and I looked at what people say when we talk about morality, and I saw that they talk about rights, they talk about consequences, they talk about good and bad, they talk about virtue, they talk about conscience. Is there one moral theory that captures it all sufficiently? And I had studied ethical theory, and I said, look, I learned a lot from Aristotle, from Kant, from Mill, from Ross, from many people. And to the extent that people say, well, this guy got it right, and you have to do everything from an Aristotelian point of view, I didn't see that. So that I was what became known or was known as a pluralist with respect to ethical theory. And if you like my theory, which I defended later on, was coherence, that you have to see how things hang together. And if rights talk makes more sense in this situation, then you talk rights. If consequences make more sense in this situation, you talk consequences. And if you want to talk to business, you can't go in with a new theory and say, hey, I'm the new Aristotle, or I'm the new whatever, and you have to learn my theory to be ethical in business. That made no sense to me. So I said, what I have to do is speak a language that people speak if I'm going to speak to business and to business students in business schools. I don't want a new language. I don't want a new theory that they have to subscribe to. I want to use what they know intuitively, if you like, or that they've learned, and see what I can do with that in order to answer the questions. Having settled that to my satisfaction, at least I felt I showed how it could be done. Then I started going through the various parts of what you learn in a business school. So I started out, you have to start somewhere, with businesses produce goods and services. But let's see what production means. Let's see how they're produced. What are the problems? You need people. All right, let's see how you treat your people. Once you make your product, and treating people raise the issue of workers' rights. I can say something more about that, but once you get your product, you have to sell it. That raised questions of truth in advertising and various issues in marketing. And then you have to worry about your customers. How do you treat them adequately? And your suppliers, how do you treat them properly? So you have to consider also the long-term effects of what you're doing. All right, that led me to various other issues, namely, what are the effects of business on society, on environment? How do you control pollution? What are the ethical issues? So the effects on how you produce a good society and how we should live together is the next stage. Then an important part of what business did was international. So there were international questions. Can we export our view of what business should be to other countries? How do you negotiate what's going on in the rest of the world? And after the fall of the Soviet Union, the question was, what do we do with newly emerging countries, with new countries. What do we do with this, with countries that are corrupt? How do we handle business while the responsibilities of business going into those areas, should they go in? So there were international problems. And finally, there were global problems, questions that we couldn't handle individually or by negotiation between or among countries, such as the ozone layer. Everybody had to take part in that if we were to do something about the hole in the ozone layer. That was a global problem. There were already climate issues that were developing. There were the questions of, does one country owe something to other countries, rich to poor? How do we negotiate that? So that my view was, we can have a comprehensive view of all these issues, and a field should consist of systematically developing all of that in one big picture. And then we see how the little pieces fit in, and individuals contribute as they want. And in the book, I tried to say, we can come to answers. You may not like the answer that I come to, but at least I'm going to show you how to attack a problem, how to consider two sides, how to negotiate the differences, and how to say, here's the best answer I can give you now. And if you have a better answer, I'm happy to listen to it. But you have to develop it and defend it just like I did. And we go from there. What I felt was, here's a field that I think we can defend as a field, and it's going to require research, good research, in order to be recognized. It's a field within which we can discuss, and we can discuss from lots of different points of view. As a field, it's going to be interdisciplinary, so that philosophers don't do the empirical work that social sciences do. And we can't ignore the fact that this is about business, and therefore businesses have to be brought into the picture and the dialogue. When we get to workers, I thought unions also had to be held to a standard of ethics and not simply say that they get a pass somehow. So this was a field in which, from an interdisciplinary view, you could bring together a lot of things that people were already doing. You could make sense of them, and you could bring things forward. You could make sense.
Just said, please don't open this door.
All right, good.
We're rolling.
So how do you see the field today? And what sorts of issues are we facing still?
Okay. Let me start by saying I am very happy with the way business ethics took off. When a small group of us back in the 70s decided to start this field, we found opposition on all sides. Businesses didn't particularly trust us and thought, if you're a philosopher or somebody in ethics, you're out to get us, and we don't want to have much to do with you. I came from a philosophy department, and the philosophy department, well, mine didn't bother me. I was already a distinguished professor, so I had nothing. My credentials were better than anybody else's in the department, so they let me do what I wanted. But the field, the philosophers in general, there was a feeling, business ethics isn't really philosophy. And the business people said, we don't really need you. And the people in social issues and management said, we've already been there and done that. So there wasn't much in the way of welcoming from the part of the people whom we were trying to talk to. And I'm very happy that if you look at things now, back then, the ordinary response to I work in business ethics was, that's an oxymoron. People may still say that. But there's so much talk about ethics in business that it's now respectable to do so. And in fact, businesses often go out of their way to present themselves as being ethical. Now, that's a major change. And I think if I go through the history of how this developed, the people that you're considering pioneers for this series played a very important role in that. No one person can take the credit, but working together, each from our own perspective, each doing different things and each taking a different angle and developing it, we had an impact. So that I'm pleased that business ethics has developed. I think now it's a respectable academic field. We have journals, we have a plethora of books, we have all sorts of things going on that are respected and that get serious consideration by our peers. So I think we've come a long way and established the field of business ethics as an academic discipline. From my own perspective, I come from philosophy, and a lot of the pioneers that you're going to interview were philosophers. And I hoped that we would continue to develop philosophers who would be interested in the field, because I felt that if you came to business ethics, you had to have a discipline behind you. If you had a degree in philosophy, that was fine. If you wanted to be empirical, you had to have research tools that you learned for sociology or psychology or whatever it is you're doing. If you're an economist, you have to know what you're doing in economics. So I felt first you have to have a discipline. Then you can become interdisciplinary and work with other people and broaden your view and show how your area of training contributes to this enterprise. Unfortunately, we found over the years that philosophers weren't being trained. Well, let me put it differently. Those of us who were philosophers who came to the field had no training in business, and we taught ourselves. The second generation, a lot of us thought maybe we shouldn't just develop philosophers, but we should develop philosophers who are also people who have an MBA or a business background or some relationship to business. And the idea of first getting your Ph.D. in a field, in a discipline, and then becoming somebody in business ethics has changed. And I am sorry that we haven't been more successful as a group of training philosophers who then turn to business ethics. And I think that's something that's affecting the discipline. The discipline, or the field rather, is losing philosophers. And the field is being taken over by social scientists. And if they are philosophers, usually they have an empirical bent and they're interested in doing experiments to show, are you more moral when you go into a telephone booth and find a quarter? We don't have telephone booths anymore, but when we did have, you go in and you find a quarter in the slot and you come out, are you more moral? Are you more likely to do something that's good rather than not so good? And experiments show, picking up the quarter, you come out, you'll help somebody whom you might have passed by, whom other people who don't find the quarter don't help. All right, that's all interesting and all good. I don't think it solves the major issues. And what I have found that disappoints me is that there are many growing issues, new issues of business ethics that the philosophers haven't jumped into. So if you consider artificial intelligence, I think businesses are moving more and more towards adopting artificial intelligence. And there are a lot of issues there other than simply privacy. And they're being looked at by people in computer science. But not many people in philosophy have jumped in and added their contribution. And I think they have a lot to contribute. So it's part of business becoming an ever-increasing need, and we don't have the people turning their attention. So I think when you have a disciplinary background, you're more interested in raising issues. What are the new questions, rather than simply supplying solutions to problems that other people bring out. And what I find is that there are fewer and fewer of the people coming up who are interested in saying, what are the real new issues? What do we have to turn our attention to that people are ignoring, that they're there, but it takes somebody with certain training to see. And so I think business ethics will continue. It's becoming more empirical. I think that probably is likely to continue because the philosophy departments aren't turning out the people with the interest. And business has become more involved, and that's good. But the field is certainly going to be different and certainly going to change as we go on. Well, we're not dealing very well with the problem of inequality.
Yes.
And inequality is really a big issue now. It always has been, but it's taking central stage. And I don't find that people in business ethics are providing any particular insight. They're joining in the discussion, but not as much as I think they could. And I think there would be more to be done on that whole issue. So inequality is one. Global issues, global warming. We have a lot of people talking about global warming, certainly a big problem, but also there's a great deal of confusion. And I think it would be nice to have some more philosophers step in and say, look, let's discuss global warming intelligently, and let's talk about the different approaches and which ones carry more weight, which ones respect people more, which one will have a better influence on the world as a whole, rather than just talk in slogans and have people adopt one view rather than another. I think philosophers have more to contribute to that, and people in business ethics especially, and we're not doing a good job. Global issues, I think, if you look at the economy and you look at China versus the United States, we're in a position now that's comparable to the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. And I think China's done a remarkable job, but they also have done a remarkably poor job when it comes to human rights and when it comes to treating people as if they are autonomous rather than simply being members of the society. So I think philosophers could turn a lot more attention to the conflict that's arising, and that the United States isn't sure to win. And I think here we have the moral high ground and should take it and should develop it. And that would be a good contribution that we're not presently making.
Yes, go ahead.
I think it'd be interesting to hear you talk a little bit about any interaction you have had with businesses. You've talked about your interaction with scholars in the scholarly community.
When business ethics started, businesses didn't really know how to handle the issues. And especially after 1991, with the federal sentencing guidelines, which said that corporations had to have ethics training programs, a senior official in charge of ethics in the corporation, they really needed help. So early on, I had been contacted by a number of corporations, General Motors, Abbott Labs, in my own area, Hallmark Cards, which is stationed in Kansas City, and a dozen or so others. And I was also asked to be an expert witness, which I didn't like doing. I tried once, and it took so much time, and actually the case was settled out of court on what I had done, and I said, I can make a contribution here. But it was too concentrated, too much effort for what I got. So I decided, no, I wasn't going to be an expert witness anymore. Consulting was taken on more and more by consulting firms, so that I was asked to go in and train 1,000 people. And I said, I can't train 1,000 people. Now, I did take the Hallmark top 100 executives and bring them in a number of different sessions, 20 at a time, through ethics, and we had ethics training for them, but I couldn't do the whole company. So that I realized, this is not my area. I'm more interested in research and looking at problems and solving them, rather than spending a lot of time training people or going to companies. So although through my career I've done some consulting, I haven't considered that a major part of my contribution, really.
Well, thank you. That was terrific. Thank you. Do you have any last comments you would like that we haven't covered that you think are...
Yeah, I'll make one last comment, and that is that, oddly enough, I found that my work seemed to be appreciated more outside the United States than in the United States. So you asked me about the honorary award, that was fine. In Italy, in the journal Politeia, they published a 50-page article on the contributions of DeGeorge to business ethics. I didn't know I had done 50 pages worth of contribution, but they came up with 50 pages. And there were other places in Europe. The book just came out in 2018, in German. And I was recognized as being one of the founders, or they mentioned me first as making an important contribution to business ethics. So, and my books have been published into Japanese, Chinese, Serbian, Russian, all sorts of strange languages. And I often wondered why. And then I figured, well, this is a book that comprehensively tells them what the area is about. And if they want to know how business ethics works, this is a good book for them to translate and read. So I just thought that was interesting that I've got more accolades in Europe, Asia, and other parts of the world than in the United States, although I'm not complaining. I've gotten a lot of recognition in the United States also, for which I'm grateful.
Can I ask you a question? Who are, alongside you, who are the, say, 2 or 3 other people you, present company excluded?
No, I can't exclude present company.
Well, who would they be and why?
Okay, people who were, I think, were most important. Pat Verheyen was one, Tom Donaldson was another, and in a completely different way, Mike Hoffman, who worked with businesses. They were very important. In Europe, we have George Enderle and Henk van Looyk, who I think were spearheading the European Business Ethics Network, and both of them joined me in starting the International Society for Business Ethics and
Business economics and ethics.
Business economics and ethics. And that group has been very influential in getting business ethics brought to countries around the world which never had it before, and have supported that development internationally. So I'd say those were key figures in developing the field.
And on a related topic, we're here at this meeting, the Society for Business Ethics. What role have these sorts of societies academically and on the business side
Right.
really played in the development of the field?
So you can't have a field with individuals gathered around, not related to one another, not knowing what they were doing. So it was very important, crucial, that the Society for Business Ethics was formed, and was formed early on. And it gave those of us who were working independently in the field to get together and talk about what was needed, how it should be done, what the issues were, what sort of training we could give students, how things should develop. Society was crucial to the field as a field. The other thing was an outlet. The Society founded the Business Ethics Quarterly, and that was a very good, strong, reputable outlet for articles in the field. So there had been the Journal of Business Ethics, there had been a few other small journals, but having journals as well as the organization were crucial to the field as a field. And I think the Society for Business Ethics has done a great job. In some ways it has maybe leaned a little too far in joining with the Social Issues and Management group. Although we wanted that interaction, the field is to some extent being ceded too much, I think, in that direction.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you.
That's great.